Good afternoon. Thank you for coming to the first lecture of Dr. Bartley's Memorial Lecture Series. I'm Zhong-Ren Peng, the Chair and Professor of the Department of Urban and Regional Planning. We set up this Memorial Lecture Series to honor the memory of Dr. Bartley's significant contribution to the university and to our department, to promote the vision and values that Dr. Bartley exemplified to advance throughout his life: sustainable environment, engagement, and making a difference. To provide a forum where people from different fields and backgrounds, young and old, can connect with each other to understand the common ideas and find inspiration and nourishment of planning and community work. To encourage students and young planners and community organizers to engage in discussion with each other to understand and have a dialogue of planning issues, policy issues, sustainability issues, and other issues that's important to the state of Florida and to our nation. Dr. Bartley was an institution at the University of Florida, having served as a faculty member for almost 60 years, with 3 decades as a professor and a professor emeritus in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning. As a planning consultant, he helped shape hundreds of zoning ordinances around the state and was the principal author of Florida's original growth management legislation. He was one of the primary consultants to Alaska's Constitutional Convention and was honored in 2005 by the Alaska legislature on the 5th anniversary of statehood. But, as we all call him, was the fellow of American Institute of Certified Planners and was commended in 2007 by the Florida chapter of APA, American Planning Association, for outstanding achievements in the field of planning. He mentored generations of students and faculty in planning and politics and left a great legacy to the university and the department. The Dr. Ernest Bartley Memorial Lecture Series is a joint effort of the Department of Urban and Regional Planning, College of Design, Construction, and Planning, the department's advisory council, alumni, and students. The vision is to invite all students, alumni, and friends to come to the university to pay tribute to Dr. Bartley's legacy and to participate in the planning-related dialogues with nationally prominent speakers. We are in the process of trying to raise enough funds to have this as an endowment, to have this as an annual event, and set up a scholarship so that Bart will be always with us, remembered in our heart, and present at the university. With us today in this evening are Dr. Bartley's wife, Ruth Bartley, his 2 daughters, Debbie Williams and Susan Miller. Dr. Bartley's grandson flew here from California yesterday, since this was originally scheduled for yesterday. And also a representative of our department's advisory council members. Our Professor Emeritus, Dr. Bartley's lifetime friends, Dr. Ernst Bartley and his wife, Dorothy and daughters Janet, and Dr. Jim Nicholas. I would also like to thank the following individuals who make significant contribution to this event. Graham Center for Public Service to provide this wonderful facility. Our department office manager, Evelyn, president of our Student Planning Association chat writings, and all the student helps for the hard work and the preparation. Our faculty for your all support and help in the process to make this happen, particularly Dr. Richard Schneider, who made all the connections and all the effort to make this happen. And of course, Governor Graham for graciously accepting our invitation to give us the first lecture, and all of you to come to this lecture series. With that, I would like to introduce our Dean of the College of Design, Construction, and Planning, Professor Chris Silver, who will make an introduction to our honorary speaker, Governor Graham.
Zhong-Ren, thank you very much. Good afternoon and welcome on behalf of the College of Design, Construction, and Planning. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker at this inaugural Ernest R. Bartley Memorial Lecture. I knew Dr. Bartley, or as Bart, as his friends referred to him, as the esteemed retired professor of urban and regional planning who never stopped contributing to the education of our future planners here at the University of Florida. But he actually began his career here at the University of Florida in 1949 as a professor of political science. His switch from political science to planning occurred in the mid-1970s when the new Department of Urban and Regional Planning was created, and during the period in which he was fully engaged in planning work in Florida and beyond. Yet it was one of the thousands of undergraduate political science students that he helped to comprehend the political and governmental processes who proved to be one of Bart's greatest legacies. Miami native David Robert Bob Graham was a Dr. Bartley protege, not just because of his successes in politics and in government service, but also because he championed Bart's faith in sound planning, environmental stewardship, effective public management, and public service. In turn, Dr. Bartley ably served his former student in helping to draft and support enactment of Florida's landmark growth management program under the Governor Graham's administration. Bob Graham, the student, was raised in a family with a tradition of public service, his mother being a school teacher and his father, Ernest Cap Graham, serving in the Florida State Senate. Bob Graham, the student, excelled at the University of Florida, as evidenced by his induction into the Florida Hall of Fame, the university's most prestigious honor. Following graduation from the University of Florida, he went on to receive a law degree from Harvard University. Then came his election to the Florida House of Representatives for 2 terms in 1966 and 68, and then 2 terms in the Florida State Senate in 1970 and then again in 1974. Graham was elected governor in 1978 and re-elected in 1982, and during those 2 administrations made an enduring legacy as champion of growth management and environmental protection in the state. He had led the Save Our Coasts, Save Our Rivers, and Save Our Everglades programs in the early 1980s, and the legislature had adopted bills in 1983 and 1984 to protect the state's waters and wetlands. In a speech opening the 1985 legislative session, Governor Graham made passing a growth management bill a top priority. And as we know, he made good on that pledge, and the 1985 Comprehensive Growth Management Act came into being, an act that fundamentally changed planning in Florida, and as various authorities have pointed out, really changed planning throughout the United States. While other states enacted growth management systems prior to Florida's new creation, the Florida model much more perfectly represented the planning profession's desire for comprehensiveness than any of the others. Governor Graham was the driving force behind that momentous initiative. In 1986, Governor Graham became U.S. Senator Graham, where he served for 3 terms and carried to Washington the passion for public service demonstrated here in Florida. The focus of Governor Graham's presentation this evening draws upon his long and devoted support for growth management in Florida and across the United States. Within a growth economy which Florida experienced in the mid-1980s when the Growth Management Act passed, an even more robust period of growth from the mid-90s through to at least a few years ago, growth management implied balancing that growth with the need to preserve the resources that make Florida so special. Now, with a dramatic economic downturn, we're confronted with a new set of challenges as we plan and manage the growth of cities and communities in Florida. Governor Graham's wisdom and ideals helped to frame the state's celebrated growth management system, with, of course, the able assistance of Ernest Bartley and others. That same wisdom, experience, and values will be drawn upon this evening to consider Florida's future in light of the current and future challenges that affect those precious resources that good planning is intended to support. Please join me in welcoming a distinguished alumnus of the University of Florida, an esteemed protege of Ernest Bartley, and a great friend to those of us committed to sustaining the qualities of our urban communities, Governor and Senator Bob Graham.
Thank you very much, and thanks to each of you for sharing some time this afternoon to give me an opportunity to reflect on a man who had a great influence on my life. I'm going to talk about Ernest Bartley in the 3 roles in which I knew him. First was as a professor, second as an urban visionary, and third as a strong advocate for this great University of Florida. I want to extend my thanks to his family, to his widow, his daughters who are here today. I also want to thank Dean Silver, Chairman Peng, and the other members of the Urban Regional Planning Department for their generous extension of this invitation. If I can just get this microphone properly organized.
The microphone doesn't work, so if this
doesn't work, eh?
Yeah, it doesn't work.
Okay, lost
this is
him.
for the webcast.
What's it?
For the webcast.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me all right? All right, good. I also want to extend a welcome to the Graham Center, immodestly called the Center for Public Service, and to the Ocora, the space in which we're occupying. Someone asked earlier, what was the word Ocora? It frequently is confused with the Greek word for marketplace, but this is actually a Timucuan Indian word, the Timucuans being the native people to this area of Florida, which meant place of assembly. So we are in the place of assembly of the natives of this community. I have an apology to issue, and that is that I wrote my speech and really somewhat fell in love with it before I got the title to the speech. So any of you who came only to hear a discussion of growth management, and sustainability in a distressed economy, where are we and where are we going, can please leave at this time. I have tweaked my speech in order to try to be faithful to the title, but admittedly, it was an afterthought. First, let me talk about Ernest Bartley, the professor. I was drawn to Dr. Bartley for many reasons, not the least of which was his first name and initial. My father's name was Ernest R. Graham, so anyone who started their name with Ernest R. had a strong advantage for me. Dr. Bartley was the quintessential college professor. If you called up Central Casting in Hollywood and asked for a college political science and urban planning professor, they would have sent you Ernest R. Bartley. He was lanky. He used to wear a blue blazer, which I am wearing tonight in his honor. He was a pipe smoker, and I understand smoked into his 70s. He used to have a glass of water at the podium when he was speaking, not to quench his thirst, but rather, as frequently happened when the ashes of his pipe fell on his jacket and started a small fire, he was able to put it out. Mrs. Bartley told me something that I was unaware of. I knew that he had scruffy shoes, but apparently at one point, after I left the University of Florida, the students raised a fund in order to buy him a new pair of shoes. Now, let me qualify these positive things that I have and will say about Ernest Bartley. He was not perfect. As has already been mentioned, he was a prime author of the state constitution of Alaska when it came into the Union. So without Ernest Bartley's academic effort on behalf of that state, we would not have had Sarah Palin as the governor of Alaska. Ernest Bartley was a distinguished member of a very distinguished faculty in the College of Arts and Sciences, and particularly in political science at that time, and I would say a cast of characters. Next door to us here is the Manning Dower building. He was the chairman of the College of the Department of Political Science. Manning had many of the same attributes of Ernest Bartley, except he wasn't nearly as well dressed. He also was a rather absent-minded person. I remember when I was in his class in political theory, he would come to the lectern and he carried a pocket watch, and he would put it down and assumedly refer to it throughout the course of his lecture, although he was perennially ran over in his time, so his references didn't have much effect. This particular day, he happened to bump against the lectern, and his watch slipped off and fell on the floor. And he looked down, and he had a white hair in a crew cut, and looked down at his watch and then continued with his lecture. One student in the class did the totally impermissible, raising his hand to interrupt Professor Dower's lecture. He ignored the student for several minutes. Finally, in a gruff voice, asked the student what was his question. The student replied, "Professor, I don't have a question, but you're standing on your watch." Another professor was called Wild Bill Carlton. He taught political parties and was himself quite active in politics. He introduced me to the word eclectic when he described himself as an eclectic intellectual, that he had 1,000 ideas in the air at any time, and he would decide what interested him. I want to think about 13th century Florentine architecture. So I'll grab that idea and I'll think about it for a while. When I'm tired of that idea, I will want to think about the emergence of rural conservatism in the Czech government in the 19th century, and I'll pick that idea out and think about it for a while and discard it. Wild Bill Carlton had a habit of leaning his chair back against the wall when he lectured. He also had a habit of not buttoning all the buttons on his shirt. So frequently the lecture was seen through the hair on his stomach and chest as he was leaned back against the wall. And the final was not a political science professor, but a history professor, Sam Proctor, whose oral history program is located on the second floor of this building. Sam loved this university, and he loved the history of Florida, and he particularly loved using the history as a means of talking about the future and what it taught us about our possibilities. Sam was a rather short, somewhat rotund person. He did not suffer fools easily. You didn't want to ask Professor Proctor a question which indicated that you had not fully understood the reading materials that you had gotten the night before. I happen to have suffered under that not suffering fools lightly several times, including a few times when I was governor and I misspoke some point of Florida history. You could expect a phone call from Sam correcting you. One quality that I particularly benefited from my association with Professor Bartley was that he was a professor who was more than a theoretician. He believed in engagement with the life of the times, and I will talk about that in a moment. And he also believed in getting his students involved. My first extensive visit to Washington was a 6 weeks internship, which Dr. Bartley arranged while I was an undergraduate at this institution. It both encouraged me to want to seek public office, and it's at a point in time to seek federal public office, but it also taught me the benefits of learning about a subject by direct involvement, as distinct from exclusively by what I'm doing here tonight, which is talking at you. That had a great impact on my view of how to understand reality. Among other things, it contributed to my decision to do work days, which for 30 years took me into the lives of the people of this state, and I attribute much of the motivation for that to Dr. Bartley. Dr. Bartley applied his engagement with the world largely as an urban visionary. He saw not Florida as it was, but what it could be. The Florida as it was a state in the 1950s and 60s which was still living with its legacy of the 19th century. There is no large population state in America that was less affected by the Industrial Revolution than was Florida. Today, we are still basically the same economic structure as we had in the 19th century, largely relying on services, tourism, and agriculture, as we did 100 years ago. We were a state which was not very receptive to the idea of government involvement in the use of private property, particularly land. In 1939, when my father was in the Florida State Senate, Florida passed the first laws that allowed its cities to engage in planning and zoning. And when we did so, we were the 48th state of the then 48 states to allow cities to engage in planning and zoning. 30 years later, when I was in the state House of Representatives, Florida passed legislation that allowed counties to engage in planning and zoning. And at that point, we were the 50th out of the then 50 states to allow counties to do so. Those timing and actions are illustrative of how difficult it was to get the state to accept the idea that there was a role for government in organizing our future. We were a state which, up until the 1940s did not have a fence law, so cattle roamed across the landscape. My dad, in the late 1930s, had gone into the dairy business and decided he wanted to go into the beef cattle business, and he hired 3 or 4 out-of-work Oklahoma cowboys and gave them the job of rounding up as many unbranded cattle as he could in West Dade County into a 1-mile square fenced area. And after several weeks of this, they had rounded up over 500 unbranded cattle in West Dade County. When my father passed away in 1964, I had just come back from school and I was involved in settling his estate, and I remember a rather prissy IRS agent who came out and wanted to know what was the cost basis of that beef cattle herd. And I told him the story, and I said, I guess it was what Dad paid those out-of-work Oklahoma cowboys to round them up. And he was totally unbelieving that as recently as the 1930s that you could go into the cattle business in an urban area like Dade County by just hiring cowboys and rounding them up. That was the nature of our state. We were also a state which was stagnant in its politics. V.O. Key wrote a book in 1949, a classic till today, called Southern Politics, and it had a chapter about each of the southern states, and it described Florida as being the state of the atom, A-T-O-M. It was every person for themselves politically in Florida, that we were the most politically disorganized state in the South, and therefore probably the most politically disorganized in the nation. When I came in the legislature in 1966, we were in the throes of a major reapportionment. The Supreme Court had ruled that you had to organize your legislatures on a one-man, one-vote basis. Florida was far from that standard, and so the impact of reapportionment was particularly severe. One of the things that it did is it began to bring a few, excuse the word, Republicans into the legislature. There was some feeling among the Democratic majority that we should try to ostracize those Republicans, not to let them become too prominent. And someone pointed out there are thousands of school children who come to Tallahassee during each legislative session in order to learn something about their state government. Most of those school children have never seen a Republican before. We need to keep a few of them around so that we can show the children what they look like. Well, now, 40 years later, the zoo animals have taken over the zoo. In the 60s, there were other things happening. Florida had taken off in a new spurt of growth. In a period of prosperity. It was a very attractive place for affluent people to come and retire, many of whom were Republicans, and they also had had a previous interest in the environment where they had lived. They carried that interest to Florida. They had a standard. They liked the Florida as it was when they arrived, and they wanted to keep it that way. And so they began to lead the first serious environmental effort in Florida. You're going to have an opportunity in a few weeks here as part of a series on land and water policy in Florida to hear from one of the people who led that effort, a man named Nat Reed, who continues till today to be a very significant figure in the environmental movement in Florida. That group initially was primarily what I would call defensive environmentalists. That is, they were trying to stop bad things from happening. And they had a target-rich environment in which to operate, because there were lots of bad things that were being proposed. There was an oil refinery that was proposed to be built at the top of the Florida Keys. There was a world-scale airport that was going to be built in the Everglades, and Earl Starnes, when he was living in Dade County, lived through that period. There were less dramatic things like saving the brown pelican from extinction. That foundation of the environmental movement on the defensive then met the bright, creative ideas of the urban visionary Ernest Bartley, that we can do something more than just wait until disaster is at the threshold, that what we ought to be doing is trying to affirmatively shape our future in a better way. Ernest Bartley had an ally. Beginning in 1969, we went into a period of severe drought. And by 1971, that drought had led to over 500,000 acres of the Florida Everglades being afire. And thick waves of smoke were going across places like Stewart and West Palm Beach and Fort Lauderdale and Miami. People began to wonder, what in the world is going on? What has brought us to this condition? In 1971, a conference was held to consider what to do about the Everglades fire, but with the vision of Ernest Bartley and other people such as John DeGrove, also a member of the faculty here, that question was quickly expanded to not what was happening with the fires in the Everglades, but what was happening to Florida. Why were we creating the conditions for such events? That led in 1972 to probably the most significant spurt of environmental legislation in the history of America. Here's a state which in 1969 was the 50th out of 50 states to allow counties to engage in planning and zoning. 3 years later, it was passing legislation to set up the largest bond issue in the history of the state in order to begin the acquisition of environmentally endangered lands. It passed legislation that gave the state the authority to declare areas of critical state concern and essentially take over the management of those areas. It created legislation that set up the 5 water management districts that were going to be responsible for managing the water areas such as those that are depicted around us here in the Ocora. Those would have been unheard of just 5 years earlier. But because the wisdom of people like Ernest Bartley met the opportunity of the disaster of the fires in the Everglades, Florida moved from being the most retarded to one of the most advanced states in the nation in terms of its legal structure to protect its land and water resources. The third way in which I knew Ernest Bartley was as an advocate for this institution, the University of Florida. And that is the subject upon which I would like to focus my attention on the topic that was given to me. John Adams once said that facts are hard things. Facts are hard things. Friends, there are some facts tonight that are hard things. And hopefully, like that Everglades fire, these will be facts that will move us to take actions that we have been reticent to do in the past. In the mid-1970s, 2 states had almost the same per capita income. And those 2 states were Florida and Virginia. Today, Virginia's per capita income is 7% higher than the national income, Florida's is 2% lower than the national income. What has happened in that interval that has caused these two southern states to go in what would be non-instinctive different directions? I think if you'd asked most people in the 1970s whether you thought Virginia or Florida had the better opportunity to enhance the economic well-being of its people, they would have said, of course, Florida. But in fact, it was Virginia. Here's what the New York Times said in a August 24th magazine story that touched on this subject. In just a few decades, Virginia has managed to transform itself in precisely the way economists think the United States must to be a high-wage economy. It has done so by a commitment to more educated people. More educated people. That is what I think our state has got to do, is to recommit itself to the fundamentals of what are going to be required to achieve the level of well-being. And in so achieving that level of well-being, making a substantial contribution to our ability to protect this beautiful environment that we have been given. We're facing some major challenges today. In September of this year, there were 43,000 Florida families who lost their homes to foreclosure. Today, the support of education in Florida, from this university to our public schools, is in the bottom quartile of the states of America. These are hard facts, but they are facts. We today have one of the highest percentages of our people who are without access to health insurance. And 25% of those Floridians who are without access are children. We are a state which is seeing a dramatic reduction in what has been our substitute for the Industrial Revolution, and that is growth. Growth to Florida is what the Industrial Revolution has been, for instance, to the American Midwest. Here are some hard facts. In the decade of the 1990s, the average annual increase in population in Florida was 261,253. In this decade, the first decade of the 21st century, that number reached a peak in 2003, 2004 of 390,000 increase in our population. It has gradually backed off. In 2006, it was down to 209,240. What do you think the estimate is as to what the net growth in Florida will be this year, 2008? Anyone want to suggest what it would be?
Decline.
Well, it's not quite that, but the answer is, the estimate is that the net population increase in Florida this year will be 4,234. That's coming off a figure of 390,000 just 5 years ago. That, friends, is a hard fact that should alert us to the reality that we cannot continue to operate in this state as we have for most of the last 100 years, depending on growth as the engine for our prosperity. It also is a statement that we need to reassess what it is going to take to build a substantially less growing Florida into a substantially more prosperous Florida. And maybe a Florida that will be able to do a better job of protecting our natural resources. I believe that begins with a commitment to education, that just as Virginia has found that the key to its leap in prosperity was its willingness to invest in all levels of education, particularly its higher education. That is a lesson that we in Florida must learn. Yesterday, the governor of Florida made an announcement, and the announcement was that he was going to ask the legislature to give to all of the state universities the authority that this university and 4 others have had, which is to raise its tuition to 15%. I read that with much mixed emotion. First, I think the people of Florida in 2002 voted to place the leadership of our state universities in the hands of people, not politicians. A federalized system which had local boards of trustees for each university and a board of governors with responsibility for the system. I believe that the people took the authority to lead the university from those people who gave us 3 medical schools in a 2-year period as an example, as a reason why a national consultant said that the first decade of the 21st century in Florida will be seen for higher education either as the wisest state in the nation or the most profligate state in the nation. I'm afraid that the jury is coming in on the latter judgment rather than the former judgment. And I am concerned that we suggest that we should return to a time when decisions were made by political forums rather than by citizens groups. And second, I'm concerned about the proposal of the 15% increase in tuition, not because I don't recognize that we have had an unsustainably low tuition rate in Florida, but rather because I'm concerned about what it says about the overall balance of financing institutions in Florida. The fact that the average support per student in our university system is $4,500 less than it was 20 years ago is not just a function of the fact that our tuition is low. It is a function of that plus the fact we haven't had the state support that we need. Traditionally in Florida, the state has provided 75% of the funding for our universities, and student tuition is provided 25%. I am concerned that unless the state is ready to provide its fair share, that proportion is going to be dramatically shifted. I have the scent of the lottery in my nostrils. In 1986, when the lottery was advocated and passed in Florida, those of you who are here may remember that the argument for its passage was that it would provide quality funding for education. It would be the margin of excellence for education. In fact, what it has become is a supplanting of what the state used to provide for education. And that scent of the lottery causes concern that we may be at a point where we're about to say that we are going to be relying on the students to provide significantly more of the cost of higher education, therefore making higher education not like Virginia did, which was to make it more accessible for more students, but less accessible for fewer students in Florida. So I think that if Ernest Bartley were here today, he would be advocating that the citizens needed to become activist and participatory at this critical time in our state's history, where we are, I think, about to make some decisions, maybe some by indecision. As Harvey Cox said, not to decide is to decide, as to where our future is going to be. And I think if Ernest Bartley were here today, he would be saying, if we are going to protect the future of this state, if we are going to assure that our future is one of increasing opportunities and excellence for our people, that we have got to be serious about making an investment in those institutions that will most likely assure that future, and that those institutions start with his beloved University of Florida. So Dr. Bartley, you have left us a proud legacy. I hope we're wise enough to follow. Thank you. Do you have some questions?
Okay. Just a second. We're going to have a question and answer session in just a moment. But before we do that, Dr. Bartley's family will give a plaque to Governor Bob Graham. So this is Susan.
Thank you.
Senator Graham, we'd like to present you perhaps the most important thing, and I know you don't have any of these. It's an alligator pen.
Yeah, great. Good.
Yes. You know, my daddy felt like he was going to die before we got an SEC championship. So we are so thrilled that he got to see that several times, and he's going to miss the national championship this year, but I know he's up there looking at us. And this is a lovely plaque. Now, this is from the Bartley family and the faculty and all the friends, and we want to, it says, presented to Senator Bob Graham, first guest lecturer for the Ernest R. Bartley Memorial Lecture Series, November 21st, 2008. And we want you to have this to put maybe up there.
I'll go right up there.
Okay, now we are open for questions.
Yes, ma'am. Could you give your, in case I lighted my pipe and burned my coat, would you give us your name and 10 words of free advertising?
Well, I'm Kendra Mitchell, and I've been in Gainesville for about 3 months, and I came to hear you. But I'm from Virginia, and very proud of what you have said. But my question is, you were concerned about the raising of tuition here. How does that compare with the tuition in Virginia today? I've been gone for a while, and I have a feeling that Virginia is charging more.
Yeah, and I'm sure it is.
Be adverse to raise the tuition here and not expect that it might be the same as Virginia.
Yeah. I am not an advocate for continuing to hold the honor of having the lowest tuition in America. But I am an advocate that there needs to be a balance as we provide additional resources. That I'll give you a little piece of math that I ran. And for those of you who are better mathematicians than I, you can check the correctness. The proposal is that on the 25% of the income that supports the undergraduate program here at the University of Florida, that the tuition be raised by 15%. I think that is the equivalent of moving from $25 to $28.75. The other side of that equation is that the legislature is now considering a budget reduction on the 75% of 5% or more. It happens that 5% of 75% is also $3.75. So when you put those two together, I think you end up with zero additional resources for the university. So my plea is that let's maintain the balance on both sides of the equation so that we don't have another lottery example where we sell people on the idea that this is going to contribute to quality when in fact it contributed to stagnation, just a shift of who paid.
I have one other addendum to that, if I might. I agree with you about the lottery, that they just shifted the funding. But my husband was in higher education and in fundraising. He was VP for advancement. I know that also supplements, that funding that they bring in supplements what the state pays. Are you seeing that as an adverse, well, I'm not sure how to phrase it, but in terms of, is the state depending on that, I should say? We always saw it as the icing on the cake, but not the batter. Is the state beginning to see that also as the batter?
Yeah, I wouldn't phrase it in the future tense. Is it about to see? It has seen it for a long time, and there's been that shift. Yes?
I'm Ruth Steiner on the faculty in Urban Regional Planning. I wanted to ask you about where you think growth management is likely to go and where it should go.
Well, I think where it should go is we have I think, a world-class legal structure for growth management. What we have been missing are the resources to make that reality. You may remember a few years ago, we passed an amendment to our sales tax to make it cover services. What's been forgotten is that increase was supposed to be used to pay for the infrastructure that was going to be necessary to support the population growth that was contemplated. I think, unfortunately, that service component was repealed, and also with it was repealed the commitment for the state to provide a substantial amount of the resources necessary to allow local communities to meet the growth that they were facing within this world-class legal structure. So I think we tried to have growth management on the cheap, and it's turned out to be very expensive. Yes, ma'am.
This is here at the University of Florida, actually. And one of those last points about really interested me, mentioning how we can improve the quality of the schools here. When I was considering the University of Florida, one of the main things that made me come here was the lower tuition. Now I'm curious if we could somehow help the university by making not just a low cost attractive to students, but quality, especially listening back on you reminiscing about professors. I'm sort of wondering if there's any economic related to that, what the state cutting down funding some services.
Well, I don't, just as I don't think you can have quality growth on the cheap, I don't think you can have quality higher education on the cheap. This is a very competitive business. There's almost 2,000 universities in the United States, and they are competing, among other things, for quality faculty members. And while this is a wonderful university and a desirable place in which to live, at some point those values can be overwhelmed by just the economics of what's available at other universities. So we've got to be competitive in order to both keep our quality faculty and be attractive to secure the new faculty members that we need.
I was just curious about that because our Alligator newspaper recently reported that the president of this university has maintained being one of the top 7 highly paid in the whole public realm, while we're getting rid of teachers from our English department. One of my friend's fathers, Professor Paxson, is in danger of losing his job, getting cut down. So it seems kind of counterproductive to be cutting our professors to make sure our economic balance fits while giving our president a nice raise.
Do I have to answer that question?
Governor Graham, Jerry Diefenbach. I'm a UF graduate and a project planner here in Gainesville, Florida. Given your legacy as a native Floridian and seeing Florida's relative youth in our union of states here, do you feel strongly that our lack of infrastructure development and connection of cities remote other than vehicles has led to the consumption of Florida at a rate that is not ultimately sustainable, and therefore feel that to preserve the spaces that we have, whether it be Tampa, Orlando, or Paynes Prairie, for example, is the key to making Florida a viable place to be for the next few millennia.
Yeah. I think it is a key. It's not a total silver bullet, but it's an important part. I came to the conclusion that if you wanted to protect important environmental assets like Paynes Prairie, you couldn't depend on doing it through a regulatory process. It needed to be in public ownership. And I'm pleased, I'm pleased but also wildly immodest to say that while I was governor, there were several years in which the state of Florida spent more money on protecting environmentally significant lands than any other state in the nation or the federal government was spending. And I think we have had land acquisition programs for a number of years with the future challenges. I think we need to assure that they are adequate to be able to continue to add to our inventory of protected lands. Yes?
I'm Bruce Day. I'm a planner every day. And sitting in Dr. Bartley's class, he enjoyed grilling us through legal cases in a voice louder than a classroom would require, maybe for a lecture hall. And he always relished in going over Graham versus estuary properties. And, tell us how that came about. Did he have any insight on it? Did he have a connection to that?
I honestly don't know if he had a specific connection to that or not. Does anyone here know the answer to that question?
Indirect, certainly through all of the legislation, and I guess in calling some of that basic strategy that the state took.
Yes.
Governor Graham, my name is Hal Lowell. I'm a graduate student here at the University of Florida, and also have the privilege of working for the Program for Resources and Communities, which is part of Cooperative Extension, and the Office of Sustainability. So in the spirit of me being in this beautiful facility for the first time, wanting to learn a little bit about the Graham Center and how it's going to help promote public service, and also with an incoming presidential administration that seems focused on, at a federal level, promoting public service. How can the Graham Center and the University of Florida help promote more sustainable growth management here in the state of Florida by tapping into our role as a land-grant university in the Cooperative Extension Service?
Well, thank you for that comment and question. I see the basic contribution that we can make is to prepare young people who are motivated and trained to be effective and honorable public and civic servants. We have a number of ways in which we are doing this. One is what we are participating in tonight and what happens here on a regular basis, and that is the opportunity for thoughtful people to come together and talk about public policy issues. We have now 32 students who enrolled in an undergraduate program on public and civic leadership, where through a combination of classroom work in areas such as economics, communications, history, and ethics, they are gaining a theoretical foundation, and then by active participation through internships and mentorships, they are out in the community. We also are hoping to start in the year 2010 a master's program in public policy, which will be the first degree program that we will offer. We also are working with the Institute on Politics at the University of Central Florida with a program to encourage more civic education and particularly participatory activities in our public schools. Last summer we trained 133 middle school teachers who will be teaching civics. And we're going to be developing classroom materials. Next summer we'll train even more public school teachers to be effective participatory citizenship educators. Two sides of the same coin. I'll give a personal example. I'm on the board of directors of a national organization that made a decision to move one of its operations out of a very high-cost area in New Jersey to someplace. They looked at 300 different locations. In the final cut, one of the final three was a Florida location. It was not selected. And the principal reason that it was not selected was because it had a significantly lower percentage of college-educated people in its population than the other two cities which were in contention. And this organization hires almost exclusively people who are college or beyond college educated. So these were 600 jobs, average salary $80,000 that aren't in Florida because we haven't provided the opportunities for more of our people to be college educated. My sense is that in today's world, if we've missed the Industrial Revolution, the question for Florida is, are we going to miss the intellectual revolution of today? That, unlike the Industrial Revolution, for which Florida had relatively few attractions. Why did industry go to places like Pittsburgh and Cleveland and Detroit? It certainly wasn't the weather. They went there because they had the assets that the Industrial Revolution wanted. They had access to natural resources, coal and iron ore. They had good, cheap transportation systems like the Ohio River or the Great Lakes, and they were close to the market where their products were going to be sold. Florida had none of those things. It may not even have gotten an invitation to join the Industrial Revolution. But today, the intellectual businesses are attracted by the quality of life that is available in a place like Palo Alto, California, which has become a dominant area for the high-tech industries. Florida is naturally a very attractive place to live, but we can't depend just on the sun and our warm climate. We've got to add to that the things that humans do, which are the institutions that undergird an intellectual economy, which are, as the Virginia quote stated, largely educated people. Yes?
I'm Randy Reed. I'm a county employee here involved in county government and also work in the city and county on sustainability. I was curious of today's the Intelligence Community Assessment 2025 report that was issued today that speaks about the fundamental change in the United States position with other world powers in the economy. And I was just curious to give you a comment on your perspective on the issue of how this economic cycle, whether this is a severe turn down or is this a fundamentally reshuffling of the world economy, and how much energy and other things like that are going to force America to change its lifestyle.
First, I have not seen the report that you referred to. Second, if I could answer the question that you just asked, I'd make a hell of a lot more money, and I would leave here and get ready to enjoy it. I think that what we're going through now is not just a business cycle, that it is a significant realignment in a number of areas. One is the area that you referred to, energy. We cannot continue to be an oil-dependent economy. I know during the last campaign, there was a chant, "Drill, baby, drill." That was it. The question is, what are you going to be drilling to? The facts are that the United States consumes 25% of all the petroleum that's lifted on planet Earth. We consume somewhat over 20 million barrels of petroleum a day. The world produces about 80 million barrels a day. Second, we sit on top of less than 3% of the known reserves. What people don't appreciate is the United States of America is the most depleted state in terms of its petroleum. If you took an analysis of what the reserves were at the beginning of the 20th century and what they are today, no country in the world has used more of its original source of petroleum than has the United States of America. We could go on a policy of relying on domestic petroleum, and we'd last until your children got ready to graduate from college. And at that point, we could have a ceremony as the last drop of United States petroleum was lifted from the underground or under the Atlantic Ocean, or with Sarah Palin's enthusiasm from the Arctic refuge in Alaska. We've got to figure out a different way to deal with our energy, and that is in many ways a metaphor for a whole series of our personal and economic practices that are not going to be sustainable in the future. Can we take one more question? Oh yeah. Okay. Yes, sir. I'm sorry. How is it up there?
It's fine.
Is it a good place to?
My name is Harvey Goldstein, and I was privileged to be a student of Dr. Bartley and Dr. DeGrove. And following in line with the county manager's question, is the center going to study perhaps how the states could or local communities could address this could be an economic disaster, and seems to be, instead of more funding for the university, less funding for the university. And do you have any thoughts about how we're going to address this problem, or how the state might address this problem?
The first question, as we were starting to think about this center, we went to a number of similar centers around the country. We went to centers in California, University of Minnesota, Duke, the Kennedy School, and one suggestion, or more than a suggestion, that we got at all the places was don't succumb to the temptation to try to be everything to everybody. That if you're going to be credible, be disciplined. Pick a few areas and demonstrate that you can be nationally successful in those, and then once you've established that foundation, you can consider moving out into other areas. We're trying to practice that principle. And the three areas that were selected, and I will take most of the responsibility for that because they were in part because they were areas in which I thought I could bring some value added to the center, were public service, homeland security, and the Americas. And at least for the foreseeable future, those are going to be three areas that we're going to focus on. In this university, there are tremendous resources to look at the questions that we've been discussing this evening in terms of the economic future of Florida. We have a great business analysis capability, which in fact has been for many years and is now being looked to as the primary source of good information on what's happening to Florida demographically and economically. Now, to your second question, yes, I think there are some things that we should do. One, we've gotten into this mantra of no new taxes, that it is the most virulent, taxes are the most virulent form of cancer and to be avoided at all costs. So while we've been avoiding new taxes, what have we been doing? Well, I talked earlier about we sold ourselves on the lottery, and now that money, instead of being qualitative, is being supplantive. We've recently signed an agreement with the Seminoles that have allowed at least one little place in Florida to become a new Las Vegas, even though the people of Florida repeatedly, by large margins, have said we don't want Las Vegas to come to Florida. We're in the process now of selling Alligator Alley, the section of I-75 that runs from Naples to almost Fort Lauderdale, not because it makes any economic sense over a long period, but because it is immediate cash to meet an immediate responsibility. This chant of drill, baby, drill, some important people in Florida took up that chant. I don't think it was because they necessarily liked the idea and the risk that might be involved, but because it was going to be a means of the state sharing in some of the revenues that are derived by granting oil leases. And now we're talking about the possibility of shifting a significant share of the cost of higher education from the state to the students. I don't think that I think those are all really narcotics to avoid having to deal with the real problem that we don't have a tax structure that's capable of supporting the needs of this growing state. So I think we've got to face up to the fact that we need a new tax structure. I personally would start, there have been on a tax base of approximately $30 billion of general revenue. In the last 10 years, we've repealed $3 billion of revenue by cutting things like we no longer collect the intangible tax. We've substantially reduced the estate tax. All of those were sold on the premise that they were going to continue to make us economically prosperous. Well, I'd say the facts, as John Adams would say, are hard things, and they ain't worked very well. So I think my first recommendation would be to look at those tax cuts that were recently enacted to see if, in fact, they achieved what they were purported to be able to achieve, and if they weren't, let's try to recapture some of that $3 billion a year. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for coming to this first lecture series. And thank you, Governor Graham, for giving a wonderful speech.
That was terrific. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very, very nice.